More about the story with clinical psychologist and the Joseph Movement founder, Tertia de Klerk. Tertia, very good evening to you. I'm grateful for your time tonight. So, as things stand here, one of the most disturbing elements that came out from Gerhard Ackerman's trial was the fact that throughout it all, he still saw nothing wrong with what he did.
Yes, I know, that's true. What we find with many perpetrators of sexual offences is the more they actually commit these sexual offences, the more they actually become numb to not only what they are doing, but actually to the victims themselves. So a continual, habit, if you can call it that, just causes an absolute numbness to the victims, and it actually escalates. So it can start with perhaps, pornography use, and then it can go to extreme pornography. It can flow over to child pornography, and then, pedophilia. And then from there, it can even escalate to bestiality. So if there's no actual control, this habit can definitely escalate.
And, I mean, in one of the issues, we talk a lot about the sex trafficking ring which he ran. Basically, it was basically passed off as a massage parlor, but the adult men who would go there, some of them went there with the expectation that they would then basically be allowed to rape these teenage boys. And when Ackerman was asked about that in one of the days in court, he gave a response to the effect of they knew what they were getting into. One of the people that these children were basically sexually assaulted by was the now late acting judge Paul Kennedy, who knew he was HIV positive and still abused these children sexually. How do you explain the reasoning from people, for example, including a person who was an acting judge, that they didn't care that legally a 14-year-old cannot consent?
Yes, of course, this is actually something that's very difficult to explain. There is absolutely no logic behind that kind of behavior. So I'm sorry to say, but I cannot give you an answer to that question. We are actually waiting for a psychological evaluation. So we are waiting on that report to be made.
And what would you be hoping to glean from such a report as far as understanding what's gone on here?
I don't think that, we will actually see anything that is new. We find that pornography plays such a big role when it comes to sexual exploitation. Pornography fuels sexual exploitation. It fuels human trafficking. And so there's absolutely no doubt that these men have been feeding off pornography for quite some time.
And what about these children then, some as young as 14, who were abused in this way? How should they be helped going forward?
Well, we have so many amazing NGOs out there, and also DSD, the Department of Social Development, that work so well together. So there's a lot of help out there for children who have been sexually exploited. But when it comes to the children, they are minors, first of all. And we know that with most of, or in fact with all of us, our brains only develop fully at the age of, early 20s. And so there's no way that anyone can ever say that, it's the child's fault, or the child knew what they were getting themselves into, that it was via consent and all of that. And what we see is that many of the cases that Mr. Ackerman has been charged with is sex trafficking cases. And so we have to remember that when it comes to human trafficking, it is a situation in which a person, no matter the age, is either tricked, forced, coerced, or even manipulated into a situation for the use of their bodies or for their labor in the case of labor trafficking. So it's just blatantly the exploitation of people's vulnerabilities. And, you know, when it comes to adults as well, adults also have vulnerabilities that can be exploited.
And I want to talk about coercion and exploitation, especially in sexual violence cases, because I've seen some literature, for example, or even in interviews where people who were victims say, for example, if it happened more than once, they felt they couldn't speak out because they were now basically, because they'd been exploited and manipulated in such a way, felt as though they were part of a, quote, dirty secret in some way. And that then prolongs how long some of the sexual violence has gone on in other cases.
Oh, yes, most definitely. You're 100% correct. That is what happens. And with human trafficking, we know that, you know, the modern day shackles is fear. And so there's always some kind of hold on these victims. Whether they, obviously with the children, they are a lot more vulnerable, and it's so much easier to manipulate them and to enforce fear. But when it comes to adults as well, so we see that a lot of the cases is a case of, you know, their lives are being threatened, or the lives of their families are being threatened. In the case of maybe someone who's well known, you know, their names being threatened, you know, they're being blackmailed, manipulated, and so forth. So there are so many tactics that traffickers, and we can safely say that Gerhard Ackerman is a trafficker, and so many tools that they use to actually keep people stuck within this in this rut as a victim. And what we also see is with sexually exploited people, especially children, what happens is they are eventually so traumatized that they no longer see themselves as victims. So it just turns out to be such a vicious cycle eventually.
And Tertia, on the issue of people being trafficked for sexual exploitation, many people, or some of us in fact wrongly, assume that it happens in grand terms where you're snatched from your home and perhaps taken to a foreign country, but it can happen down the road in the city right next to yours, right?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good point, and it's so important to mention that and to point it out. That is such a vital fact when it comes to human trafficking. So we have to remember that trafficking does not require transportation as a prerequisite. So trafficking can take place anywhere. It can actually take place in even a child's home, where a child is, for instance, prostituted out of their own home by a carer or a parent for money, obviously. So no, we must never think of human trafficking as something where a person has been snatched or kidnapped or abducted, or only think of it as a person who's tied up or in shackles, or even just think about it as a case where a container has been shipped across the borders. No, we have to remember that human trafficking is the exploitation of people's vulnerabilities. So just a very easy and short summary of what exactly human trafficking is, just to remember, is it happens when a person is either tricked, forced, coerced, or manipulated into a situation for the use of their body or for their labor. So that means it can happen absolutely anywhere. It can happen, as you say, next door, down the road, in your community, and of course also cross borders.
Tertia de Klerk, good to speak to you. Thank you so much. Clinical psychologist and founder of the Joseph Movement. Thank you.